Welcome to Aquarian Diary, where we discuss issues around the emerging age of Aquarius. I'm your host, John Irving. Thank you for joining me. Greetings all, it is September 4th, 2022. Today I want to talk about something that came to me in my spiritual practice last night very clearly and very powerfully. Before I do that, just a couple small house cleaning points. First, I just want to mention that I published my episode titled The Subversive Attack on Liberal Democracy. I did a short version and a long version. I published those on Wednesday, August 31st. And then President Biden did his speech about the threat to American democracy from MAGA extremists on Thursday evening, which I watched live. Now, I was really struck by many of the parallels between what I had talked about in my episode on how democracy is being subverted deliberately and what President Biden said. Now, of course, I'm not trying to put myself on his level in any way. I just thought it was striking how many of the points I was making, he was making as well. And I just thought that was really interesting. The timing of it, that I was, a day ahead of that. So very cool from my perspective. When you put yourself out there like I'm doing here right now, it can be a bit kind of nerve-wracking because you're like, well, what if I'm wrong? And, I'm sure most channels and other people have gone through this experience. Because, nobody wants to be an idiot. So it's really cool just to see how reality reflects your impressions. Secondly, I added a feature to my website, which is aquariandiary.com. And all it does is it allows people to add their name and email to a contact list. I'm not intending to use this as a marketing tool or anything like that. It's just that I'm always nervous that if, say, for example, we couldn't use this platform in the way that we have, that we would just suddenly lose touch. And I think these connections are potentially meaningful and important in the long term. And I've been involved in other situations in the past where stuff like that has happened, and it's always really disappointing when that occurs. So if you want to, you can add your name and email to my contact list, and I would kind of use it in the event that we're disconnected or there's something really major going on that it's important for people to be aware of. I'm not planning on sending out, daily, weekly, or even monthly messages to that list. This is private. It's not for marketing. I would never sell people's contact information or anything like that. That came to me intuitively, actually, so I spent a few hours yesterday setting it up. My website is slow. Bear that in mind. I'm trying to resolve that with my hosting provider now. That was another little housekeeping thing. Now on to my main topic. And this is a big one. And it came to me in my spiritual practice last night, where I was asking in my spiritual practice for guidance on a topic I wanted to discuss, which is very closely related. And I'm kind of in a deeper, sort of more spiritually aware state during this spiritual practice. And some images and things came to me very clearly that were extremely moving. It actually made me cry for quite a while because it was so powerful. And so let me just set the stage here a little bit for this. In order to really talk about this subject, I had to think about it quite carefully and deeply to really reflect on why I find certain things objectionable. That process can occur naturally often without us really being conscious of what it is that we find offensive. So bear with me while I go through this process of untangling of what it is I find objectionable about a certain worldview. So, as I mentioned in my previous episode, I spend quite a bit of time reading, and I will often read comments at reasonably good websites. And I'm trying to understand what is going on the other side of the spectrum. Say, for example, the mega crowd, this increasingly extremist and disruptive segment of society. And really, what I'm trying to do is understand what their motivation is. Why are they acting this way? Because, from my perspective, it appears to be irrational. And I say that because of all the conspiracy theories and stuff like that, that many people just recognize as being blatantly false or fabricated or not grounded in reality. Because to understand a problem or situation, you always have to look at it from both sides. And I think it is responsible to do that. I'm always questioning my own perspective and my own beliefs and my own paradigm, because I don't want to just make a whole bunch of assumptions about things based on my own preferences that distort my perspective of reality. I will point out that that's one of the objections I have where, say, for example, like on CNN, they'll have a panel discussion and there'll often be someone involved who is a spokesperson for the political right. One of the issues I have is that it's very clear to me that a lot of times these people are not really engaged in a good faith debate or discussion. It's more like they're just there to get as many talking points out as possible. They will often use techniques such as whataboutism, which is really just a form of deflection to steer the conversation away from the point so that they don't have to address it or discuss it. Or they will turn the discussion away from an important subject, leaving it unaddressed. There are straw man attacks where they attack the person in question and their character versus, again, dealing with the actual issue. And so effectively, they really come across like they're just spin doctors trying to score partisan points for their team. Now, I really dislike these kinds of techniques because to me, they're dishonest and they are underhanded and manipulative, show a lack of character and moral fiber, because there's an opportunity here to discuss an issue and look at both sides of it seriously, and instead they try and skirt around the issue or change the subject, like I said, or deflect, or even they will inject points that are of questionable veracity, which then sends everybody off into a tizzy because they're like, well, that's just not true. And now again, you have changed the subject. You've not addressed the core issue. These are all really very low level tactics. If someone was dealing with you like that in real life, you would get really angry with them because you'd say, you're avoiding dealing with the real issue. They just lack credibility and authenticity. Now, I very rarely actually see those kinds of tactics deployed by people on the left that I respect, like very rarely. And again, I'm talking about commentators and analysts here, not politicians running for office and stuff like that, or politicians in office. On the right, it seems to be more important to score points for the team versus actually having substantive conversations that get to the core issues in a fair and balanced way. I am willing to listen to perspectives, but only if the person I'm addressing is actually listening to me. If you're having a conversation with somebody and you, after some time, realize that they're not actually listening to what you're saying or they're not hearing you, it gets extremely annoying. And again, this is all based on the premise that what is being said is legitimate and authentic and credible and based on actual evidence. So there's a difference between an opinion and a fact. And so there seems to be this mismatch here where people on the right believe that their opinions are more important than facts. And I dispute that. I just find that unacceptable. There are certain vague topics and issues that are very subjective, clearly. But when we're talking about reality, and especially when it comes to policies that affect many people, we have to deal with facts. Like, for example, Putin did not invade the Ukraine to free them from Nazis. That is just an absurd and preposterous claim that basically, if you believe that, I'm sorry, but you're an idiot. Like, there's not a shred of credible evidence to support that assertion whatsoever. And it's very clear that his agenda is actually territorial. He wants to conquer additional territory. He doesn't give a crap about the Ukrainian people. Because if you believe that, like I said, you have problems. I very rarely find someone from a right-leaning perspective who I consider to be credible. I'm sorry, but if I'm talking with someone and they start spouting conspiracy theories or what is clearly misinformation, the fact is I immediately start to lose a certain degree of respect for them. That's just the way it is. Now, if somebody does that deliberately, that's a whole different thing. It's even worse, of course. People who deliberately try and mislead or misinform other people, it's extremely difficult to respect these people for obvious reasons. A lot of right-wing commentators, writers, journalists, and politicians do that. There are tons of right-wing websites that spew complete and utter BS constantly, like on a daily basis. Zero respect from me. I just really despise lies. Yet some people make a profession out of it. And then there's also all of the hypocrisy, right? The blatant hypocrisy. Like, how can people who claim to be religious support someone like Donald Trump? I mean, you just can't square that. It's a non sequitur. So we need to bear all these kinds of things in mind when we consider why these people seem to be upset or frustrated that their views are not taken seriously, or that they feel like they're being marginalized, or that they do not receive adequate respect. What is the cause? Who is responsible? My point is that it's not likely you. Now, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but I'm trying to set the stage here. So when I read the comments of a lot of these people sort of coming from a right-wing perspective, they often will say things like, we're not being respected. Our views aren't being considered. We're being demeaned. People are talking down to us, the elites, blah, 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 blah. People aren't taking us seriously. And I'm like, well, this is me thinking while I'm reading this. I'm kind of like, well, why do you expect people to take you seriously when you reject science? You reject facts and evidence. Completely valid and normal criticism is perceived as a bias. Anybody who criticizes any conservative politician is immediately biased, regardless of the quality of their arguments or concerns. In other words, another conspiracy. The most privileged human beings who have ever walked on the planet in the history of humanity are, in fact, the victims and being persecuted. Such a position is nothing short of ludicrous and would be laughable were it not so dangerous. White Americans, that right there alone. You reject logical debates and arguments like, why shouldn't women have the same rights as men? Stuff that's just really common sense. It's very hard to defend a lot of those positions. Or, like where they'll reject climate change and climate scientists because they're somehow involved with the fossil fuel industry. Obviously, they have a conflict of interest, and it seems quite likely that their objection to the science has nothing to do with the science itself. It's just about the fact that it's going to negatively impact some industry that they're involved in. So they feel that science is against them, that liberals are against them, that their views aren't being respected. And I'm saying that often it's because their views are literally not respectable. How do you respect somebody, like I said, who rejects reality? So I always get stuck there. So it kind of boils down to that reality is against them, or it's against their perspective or their paradigm. And they then proceed to gradually start rejecting reality or rejecting the consensus view about reality. And then they end up feeling like they're being persecuted and dismissed. And they become increasingly isolated, and they become increasingly tribal and insular, finding other members who share their own or similar views, creating a feedback loop or echo chamber. And you end up with this rage of resentment. Now, again, this is kind of a non sequitur, because we can feel empathy and compassion for these people because they're not happy or they don't like what's happening. But I'm not going to change my views about reality just because somebody else is not willing to accept it. Like, I'm just not going to go like, yeah, you're right. All the scientists are wrong. And, we don't need to do anything about the environmental catastrophe that's unfolding in front of our eyes. Or that we should go back to a society that's patriarchal, which is just nonsense. To me, I just can't, like, it's not going to happen. Short of fascist rule or something like that. So how do you square these two things? How do you bridge that gap? I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this are kind of in the same boat. Like, what do you do with somebody who just literally is unwilling to accept fact and evidence and reality? A good case in point is ivermectin. Remember that during the COVID pandemic? All of these fringe people were promoting that as a solution. All of the experts were saying, like, this is a horse tranquilizer. What the hell does it have to do with viruses? And of course, now they've done studies and it's completely useless for treating COVID. That's just a fact. But that issue raged for months and years. I mean, I do not want to get in an airplane unless it's piloted by somebody who knows what the hell they're doing. Why would I trust people who don't have expertise in any topic to advise on any subject? It just doesn't make any sense. We have mechanisms of vetting people and accrediting them in order for them to achieve a greater status in any given field. If I'm going to hire somebody to build a house for me, I'm going to find a person with the most experience, the most expertise, the most good quality referrals, and so on. I'm not just going to find some guy on Kijiji. And I've actually seen this happen where whole structures had to be torn down and rebuilt because people don't know what they're doing. I mean, who would do something like that? It's just completely irrational. And yet such things occur all the time with the political right on often major and very important issues. And that is because when you have policies that are not intellectually defensible or cannot be defended based on evidence and which are not supported by experts, what they do is they discredit the experts and various fields in order to circumvent legitimate analysis. It's the only way you can justify your position if it's not grounded in reality. And over many years, this has been occurring to such an extent that people do not trust anybody anymore. Whether that's valid or justifiable or not, This process of constantly attacking expertise and framing them as elites and things like that has led to some very dangerous outcomes, be they environmental or health related or socially related or whatever. Very deliberate, but dangerous. That is, in fact, the whole point of conspiracy theories, to confuse and disorient people so they don't know what the hell to do. It's a malignancy. It's like a poison. Again, very deliberate. See my previous episode. Another point is credibility. If a left-leaning commentator or figure or journalist even was engaged in some activity that everyone found reprehensible, there would be a very sudden and immediate backlash against that person. And that has actually already happened many times. We have standards and we uphold those standards and we apply them, even if it's someone on our own side, so to speak, if you want to speak in partisan terms. On the other hand, when we look at the Republicans and the GOP, there have been countless, I mean, you couldn't even count them all, examples of completely reprehensible behavior. And often there are no consequences for it. And the person is still elected, still engaged, still active, still publicly speaking, still invited on television, stuff like that. Personally, I would simply never associate with any organization that in any way condoned or enabled, say, for example, racism. And yet there are countless examples of both politicians and members of the Republican Party who have been aligned with and associated with such groups or individuals. Now, that to me is just simply a line I would never cross. I find the whole concept or notion completely repugnant. And to me, this is one of the most significant points of all of this. How does an organization like that continue to sustain itself while being affiliated or associated with such groups? Or at the very least, harshly condemning them, if not purging them from their ranks. Anything less is tacit complicity. I think right there, that tells us everything we need to know. We have different standards. Now, there may be situations in life where you simply have to interact with these kinds of people on occasions, but most of us would rather not. And if given a reasonable choice, we would simply not be affiliated with them. This is a huge point, very important point. All you need to do is ask yourself, if you had a choice, would you associate with these people? And I'm sure right now I'm hearing no, no, no. Well, there you go. This tells us everything we need to know. It is shameful and shameless. Finally, there's the issue of threats and intimidation. And we know that the political right is now considered to be the main concern for domestic threats by the intelligence agencies. And as I talked about in my previous episode, all kinds of politicians, journalists, and other public figures are receiving just out of control levels of harassment and intimidation from people who are very clearly coming from a right-wing perspective. This is, again, irrefutable. I'm sure there are cases where that happens with left-leaning people, but they seem to be extremely rare and extremely small in proportion to the overall number of events like that are occurring these days. You're always going to have occasionally the oddballs, right? But this is almost a daily thing that's going on now. Clearly, the intent is to intimidate and silence dissent or critics. This is a classic fascistic practice. We have no way of really knowing how many, for example, journalists are going to leave their positions because of fears for their safety or the safety of their loved ones. This is a very perilous situation because if public figures are forced to shut up, basically, due to thuggish intimidation, that is a critical threshold for the safety of democracy. A red line. And there are many cases where those actions may not be condoned publicly, but they are not sufficiently criticized. For example, with Trump, the whole stand down and stand by thing, Charlottesville. There's been lots of examples of that. Can you think of any examples where a left-leaning politician has advocated violence? No, I can't. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm just saying nothing comes to mind in recent history in this part of the world anyway. In terms of racism, which is obviously a serious problem, there is only one way to address it, and that is to make it completely socially unacceptable. Despite the howls of protest from the right about cancel culture, it simply has to be made socially unacceptable. There is no other way to address that issue. We can't stop people from feeling that way or thinking those kinds of things. But clearly, racism is extremely unfair and unjust and harmful as well as dangerous, and it has to be made obsolete. In fact, I would argue that there is a direct correlation between one's outrage about cancel culture and this very issue. There is no equivalency between the experience of racial and ethnic minorities and white people in contemporary society. And anyone who suggests otherwise is a fool. I'm of the perspective that we have to look at and deal with the reality as it is, not as we would like it to be. And we start from there. So anyway, I asked in my spiritual practice for guidance on how to address this topic because I want to do it in a way that is meaningful. So I'm doing my spiritual practice. I asked for some guidance on this from my guides. Whew, this is strong energy here. And I was shown an image, very clear, like a scene that actually occurred in my life many, many, many years ago. When I was young, I was probably in my early 20s. I was at the time working at a cabinet making shop, and they had hired a guy who was kind of like from a very rural area, a very simple guy, very nice guy. One of those people who, I don't know if you know the type, but they want to show how dedicated and how committed they are, and they'll just do whatever that has to be done. And it's kind of a way of showing their strength and reliability in order to gain respect from other people, is to be really just like a hard worker. And I was more at a level where I was reporting directly to the owner because I was doing designs and stuff like that and doing some of the higher end stuff. So I walk by and there's this guy stripping furniture with chemicals, and he's not wearing gloves. So I just kind of go like, and I'm just young, right? I look at the guy and his hands are all covered in blisters and things like that. And I'm just like, holy crap. So I immediately go to the office and I say to the owner, I'm like, you have to effing do something about this, like right now. Get someone, go to the hardware store, get this guy some proper gear for the job he's doing. This is ridiculous. The guy doing the work never asked because he just wants to show that, oh yeah, I'll do whatever needs to be done, he doesn't want to complain. So that actually happened. They outfitted the guy with some gear, like immediately, like this was just, I couldn't believe this actually happened. But anyway, and then the guy, I didn't make a big show of it, but the guy, I think, heard me arguing with the owner in the office. which was just directly part of the shop. And then after that, that guy was always like super nice to me. He had a level of respect for me because I stood up for him. He wouldn't do it himself because he was new there and stuff like that, right? And they showed me that image because we have a responsibility to look out for, and I'm getting really strong energy here. We have a responsibility as a society to look out for and protect vulnerable people. And I think, in short, that this is where politics and politicians and the political system has been failing. A country or a society or a community is only as good as its least favored member. As far as I'm concerned, if there's someone living on this street, and I'm not suggesting that we force anything on anyone, but that should be the top priority, is dealing with that problem. Or if people are hungry or living in abject poverty or homeless or whatever the case may be, it's kind of like we have our priorities completely ass backwards. And that if the Democratic Party, for example, made an effort to really go out and deal with some of these really deep structural and systemic problems, over time, those people would become very loyal to the Democratic Party. Now, it may take years, it may even take generations, but that is how you build a strong community and you gain respect for what you're doing. Now, I know the political realities are that the GOP very much favors the wealthy and the powerful and have been relentlessly obstructionist. And also, very wealthy donors are inclined to support the GOP because that's how they get their tax breaks and everything else. And it's very clear if you look at their policies and you're informed. And so the Democrats have to kind of fight that. But as a society, like I said, there are some appalling things that occur, and they've worsened over decades. When I was a kid, I don't think I ever even saw a homeless person. Sometimes you'd see alcoholics outside of the liquor store or something like that. But that was kind of it. It was like on a very, very small scale. So society has been failing its weakest and most vulnerable members for many, many years. Now, I don't want this to sound pithy or overly emotional, but this image that I was shown was very powerful. And it just basically showed how, like I said, when we take care of those people in need and who are vulnerable, we gain their respect, their trust, and their admiration. And this, I think, can be sort of summarized with compassion. Now, nobody told me to do what I did in that case. And there have been other cases, too, where I have stepped up to defend people who were in positions where they were powerless or where there needed to be some kind of intervention. I've done that on quite a few occasions. But, like I said, that's what I was shown. You know, I read a statistic that there's like 500,000 homeless people in the United States now. That, to me, seems like a really understated number. That's a government statistic. I suspect it's probably much higher than that. And then if you get into people who are living sort of on the edge, it's probably like much larger than that. And Bernie Sanders wrote a piece which I shared on my community tab yesterday that just perfectly addressed all this kind of stuff, interestingly. If you look on my community tab, you'll find a link to that. It was in The Guardian. And I thought, oh my God, he's just summarized the whole thing in one article. And Bernie Sanders is right. This is really the root of all of this social dysfunction and all this craziness that's going on. If people are happy and healthy, have health care, know that their children are going to have a life that's at least as good as theirs and hopefully better, people are happy. People don't need to go into all kinds of fringy, crazy conspiracy theories. to explain why their lives are the way they are. Not everyone has kind of time that I do to read, for example, and thus be as well informed. We can't expect that. That's just not realistic. So, what I'm saying is that we need to lift up the standard of living for the bulk of society. And when we do that, we will just basically create a much better, healthier, happier society for everybody. Again, I know this sounds really pithy and simplistic, but that is really the root of what's going on right now. And I think what we're starting to see is that if that is left unchecked for too long, it can literally result in the collapse of society and maybe even some form of social conflict or even a civil war. So there's a lot of bad actors, and this is why I get so upset about certain figures, because there are people who are trying to capitalize on and inflate that resentment and anger. And that to me is very dark. These people have like no moral compass, basically. They're just actually making the situation worse deliberately. And we need to combat that for sure. So we may not be able to make everybody into a rational actor, but I think what we can do is we can make enough people who are grounded in reality and more sort of centrist that it's not going to result in the collapse of our societies. It's not an all or nothing thing. Like, there's always going to be some people who are conspiracy theorists. But let's be clear, conspiracy theorism was a really fringe thing years ago, like really fringe. And these people were just kind of, most people just thought they were kooky or weird, and they hardly ever spoke out. I guess now with social media, you hear this all the time and it gets amplified. What I'm saying though is that, like I said, there'll always be people on the fringe. There'll always be some extremist elements out there, but they'll be in very small numbers that don't actually threaten society overall. So that's it. I think that we need to completely rethink our priorities. We should address all of these systemic problems. And that should be job number one for, let's say, the Democrats in the United States and other progressive parties elsewhere. And that it's a kind of a long game. And I know that there are forces against them. But what I'm saying is that if we really genuinely put the interest of these people ahead of our own in order to fix society and have a better society, we will eventually arrive at a more stable and more peaceful state. And I've said this before, I have talked a lot about materialism and things like that in other episodes. And I've talked about how materialism is destroying our environment. And I think it all comes back to that in this way. Like, we have these people, especially in the States, you have these politicians who make vast amounts of money compared to ordinary people. And to me, that is just disgraceful. What ends up happening is that you end up with people in power who are just there for the money, and they're not all of them, of course, but there's a lot of politicians who are just there for the power or the money. And that's the wrong thing. We need leaders who are actually protecting and representing the best interests of their constituents, period. So that's how things are broken. That is what we need to do to fix everything. It's kind of stating the obvious, and I'm not the first person to say this, but the way that it came to me and the way that the message was delivered to me, and at the time I felt it was very important to share this, because I have been thinking about what is going on and why everyone is going so crazy and acting in such a bizarre way. And of course, it's being amplified by bad actors, but we can undercut that by going to the root of the problem and addressing some of these systemic income and quality of life related issues. And good education should just be something that is available readily to anybody who wants it, period. You shouldn't have to be the child of a billionaire to go to a really good university if that's what you want to do. That is such a disgraceful thing. The minds and brains of young people are the most valuable assets in society. It's not corporations or money. You don't know who is going to be the next genius who comes up with a clean energy solution that changes the world. We don't. They could come from anywhere. And so anybody in society should be able to get an education. So I've talked about that stuff before too. That's kind of what I wanted to say. This is a bit rambling and a bit long because I don't really know how to convey what I experienced in my spiritual practice. It was very emotional and it was very powerful. It wasn't about intellectualism at all. It was about compassion and heart. I'm not suggesting charity because a lot of people are ashamed to have to receive charity. I'm suggesting we just create a more level playing field, all we need is fairness. And I think that's what's missing. The system is not fair. And people know that even if they don't read the news and read a lot of analysis and stuff like that, people know the system is against them. People worship high profile celebrities and stuff like that. What we should be doing is we should be really putting people on a pedestal who are out there really helping people hand to hand, directly, face to face. We have our priorities completely wrong because very few people are going to achieve that state of celebrity and wealth. And there's going to be very few billionaires. They're a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. So very few people will realize that or experience it. As I was working on this, I became aware of how this could be a whole book, that I could spend a lot more time on this. And it's a fascinating subject because it really underpins a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world these days. And I took a break at one point while I was working on it, and I went outside and I thought, this is the age of Aquarius. The age of Aquarius is all about ideas. And we're experimenting with all of these ideas. And we're learning about how powerful ideas are and how they shape reality. And that will be a very big part of the Aquarian age. I kind of had a download. That's one of the key differentiators between sort of the age of Pisces and this age of Aquarius, where it's just going to be about all these really fast moving and intense and sharp ideas that somehow then shape reality very powerfully. It would be fascinating to watch the whole thing unfold. I apologize if I'm jumping around here a bit in this episode. It takes me 2 days to produce something like this. It's a bit of a stream of consciousness. If I had more time, I could do this in a more organized fashion. I do share links and articles I'm reading more prolifically on Twitter, and you can follow me there at Aquarian Diary. Anyway, thanks for everything. Take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.